Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our Emerging Research Speaker Series. We are so lucky to have Dr. Shannon Speed this morning, and we will rush through our intros to give Dr. Speed time to give an amazing talk this morning. And I will introduce our president, Anna Esquivel. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Speed, for being our presenter today. I appreciate everyone's time and want to apologize for the technical difficulties experienced this morning, but we will have a wonderful presentation. And now I turn it over to Dr. Speed.
Chukma, Yapako, Antalia Sayupa, Gabrielina Tongva Yagni Akot, Hachimanolili, Yakoki. Greetings, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you all today. Thank you for the invitation to share some of my work. I am grateful that the invitation was specifically for emerging research because while a lot of the research for this book has been done, it has yet to do very much emerging onto the page. So I'll mostly be describing what I want to do with the book in the future. And, you know, as such, it might be a little less polished than it will ultimately be, but I appreciate you all listening. I do have a title on the page, which is something, and the title is Chickasaw Spring, Resurgent Sovereignty of a Native Nation. And this is a collaborative project with my tribal nation, and it's under contract with my tribal press, the Chickasaw Press. We're the first tribe that I know of to have their own academic press. And so I'm really honored to be working on a project with them. So I want to start with a little quote from our tribe. So this is, I'm quoting someone else here. Chickasaw history is conceptualized in 4 seasons. Summer, the start of Chickasaw New Year, is marked by the green corn ceremony and encompasses the lives of Chickasaw ancestors pre-contact, pre-European arrival, when our lifeways and language were fully intact and strong. Fall, marked by the closing of the ceremonial grounds and preparation of food for the long winter, encompasses the challenging years of the 18th century, when the Chickasaws were hard-pressed on all sides by the French and French-allied Choctaw, losing hundreds of our people to warfare and disease. Winter is marked by the hunger months of limited food and long nights filled with tribal stories, encompasses the horrors of removal to Indian territory beginning in 1837, the struggles of reestablishing our nation in these new lands, and the losses of civil war, as well as the heartbreak of allotment, as our tribal government was for all intents and purposes terminated and our tribal lands broken up into individual allotments. Winter continues into the lean years of the mid-20th century as we struggled to survive without a functioning government, limited financial resources, and a population increasingly forced to leave traditional communities in order to find work. Spring, traditionally marked by the return of ball play, dances, and the first growth of wild onions, encompasses our present Chickasaw cultural and political renaissance. So that's the end of the quote. In 1971, the Chickasaw Nation elected its first governor not appointed by the federal government in more than half a century, marking the return of Chickasaw Spring and setting it on a path to reclaiming tribal sovereignty forcibly eroded over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. In the following 4 decades, the nation would engender a remarkable renaissance, becoming an economic powerhouse, reclaiming political sovereignty, building the infrastructure to provide for all citizens, and revitalizing our culture and language. Chickasaw Spring explores this dramatic resurgence of sovereignty in the Chickasaw Nation, a complex and inspiring story that has much to tell us about sovereign resurgence as a dynamic for all Native peoples today. It will ask, excuse me, in what ways did Chickasaws hold on to their identity and sense of belonging through the long Chickasaw winter, setting the framework of possibility for the coming spring? What were the roles of tribal leadership in envisioning and constructing the Chickasaw Renaissance? What were the building blocks of this reclaimed sovereignty? And what does the Chickasaw experience tell us about tribal resilience, resurgence, and the future of Native nations? The principal argument of the book is that the Chickasaw Nation and its people, by storing the seeds of sovereignty through long decades of winter, sowing them thoughtfully and responsibly in the dawning spring, and tending and expanding these crops with care as they began to flourish, are now reaping the reward of that ongoing work in an unprecedented resurgence of sovereignty. While the Chickasaw experience is unique, it nevertheless provides an important example of how Native nations, even when significantly depleted by over a century of successive U.S. Indian policies, can effectively combine economic development, political reconstruction, and cultural revitalization in order to reclaim and exercise self-determination. So a little bit of background. This is summer, fall, and winter very quickly. And we could go to the next slide, please. Is there one between those two? Sorry, back up one slide maybe. Nope, okay, we're missing a slide. Okay, you can go to the next one. Thank you. So our origin story says that we migrated from the West, interestingly. The Chickasaw and Choctaw in this origin story were one people, and we were led east by a white dog, Ophitobi. We crossed what would later be called the Mississippi River, where the white dog perished in the crossing, and our people split there into two groups that would become the Chickasaw and the Choctaw. The Chickasaw would settle near the Tombigbee River in present-day Mississippi and Alabama. Our ancestral homelands encompass what would become northern Mississippi, northwestern Alabama, western Tennessee, and southwestern Kentucky. We were matrilineal and known as fierce warriors. As European powers encroached, we were aligned with the English against the French and were instrumental in a number of decisive battles. Over time, we had extensive trade with the English. We were part of what were called the 5 civilized tribes due to our high degree of assimilation, relations with Europeans, and also our high degree of literacy, which was considerably higher than that of most white settlers who were moving into our territory. Chickasaw winter began in 1830s when we were relocated on the Trail of Tears, a brutal process in which our communities were forced west into what was then called Indian Territory and would later become the state of Oklahoma, which literally means red people in Chickasaw. In fact, we were forced to purchase land for our own removal. The 1837 Treaty of Dokesville with the Choctaw Nation granted us the right to settle our people inside the district of Choctaw Territory. The Choctaw had already been removed on the Trail of Tears to Indian Territory. So when we made it to Indian Territory, the Chickasaw Nation was located within and encompassed by the Choctaw Nation. And partly because of that, we have a lot of interrelations of our tribes. I'm Chickasaw and Choctaw by descent and enrolled citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. As you can imagine, removal was hard, and things in Indian Territory were also very difficult because, for one thing, we were under Choctaw political control. It took a while, but in 1856, we were able to purchase our own land and restore our government and authority. In 1867, we ratified a constitution forming 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judiciary. Just 3 decades after we successfully reconstituted our lands in Indian Territory, the federal government established the allotment system through the Dawes Act of 1887. That meant that our lands were broken up into individual parcels of private property and no longer collectively held. We could go to the next slide. So a few decades later, the federal government established Oklahoma statehood. And then virtually, and the word virtual is key here, and I'll explain why later, but virtually disestablished our government and imposed severe limitations on our sovereignty and our tribal governance. And so you can see where the Chickasaw Reservation was after we moved out of Choctaw, which is just to the right. And that remained our tribal boundaries after statehood. But from that point on, from Oklahoma statehood in 1907 on, our tribal government was appointed by the federal government and served for much of the 20th century, principally as a liaison to Washington. So for the next 6 decades, there was a great degree of cultural loss and language loss, but Chickasaw people retained their sense of unique identity. Even as Christianity became the dominant religion, it was within the Indian churches themselves that the seeds of our culture were maintained and where the political movement to retake our tribal sovereignty was fostered. It was in the 1950s, in the era of federal Indian policy, with the brutally blunt moniker of termination, which meant ending the federal trust relationship between the federal government and the tribes, combined with an effort to forcibly finally assimilate all Native Americans once and for all, was in that context that the Sealy Chapel movement emerged. And we could go to the next slide. Those are just photos of Sealy Chapel. So by the early 1960s, as we were moving into a period of the Indian Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights era, the Sealy Chapel movement gained a victory in getting the longtime governor that was appointed by the federal government removed, and having one of their own, a young man named Overton James, appointed as governor. That's Overton James there. As governor, he would work closely with allies in the Bureau of Indian Affairs to reestablish popular elections and thus put the power of choosing our political leaders back in the hands of Chickasaw citizens. In 1971, Overton James became our first governor since 1904, our first elected governor since 1904. So that was a watershed moment. And Governor James's administration opened up this period of sovereign resurgence and political cultural revitalization that I'm treating in the book. So it's in many ways the start of the story I want to tell in the book, Chickasaw Spring. Several things happened during the James's 2 decades as governor that I think are significant for shadowing what was to come. The first is that beginning in the late 1960s, he undertook an aggressive grassroots health campaign, training and sending healthcare workers throughout the Chickasaw Nation to go door to door and provide health services to people. So this is rural Oklahoma on a tribal reservation. People were impoverished. Many lacked basic services like indoor plumbing at that time. And healthcare was for many almost non-existent. But why was that dynamic so important? I think because it demonstrated an approach to tribal governance that was about care. What Governor James embodied was the idea that the tribal government should exist to care for and improve the lives of our people. This will be key. So the second thing that happened was we bought a rundown motor lodge in the declining resort town of Sulphur, Oklahoma. That's the motor lodge there. Why did this matter? In addition to running our tribal government out of it for a number of years, this was our first tribal business. Governor James understood that our BIA trust funds would only continue to decline. Already a very small amount of money was only going to decline over the years as we utilized it, and so that we would need our own sources of income to function as a sovereign nation. It was here in the Motor Lodge that our first bingo nights began operating, leveraging tribal sovereignty to facilitate tribal gaming. And the third thing that happened was that a very vocal group of tribal citizens began to call on Governor James to implement a constitution. Though he was not obligated to do so as elected governor, he saw the wisdom in the calls for a democratic structure for tribal governance. A process was undertaken, and which I'll discuss a little more later, but in 1983, tribal voters ratified a new constitution that, like the Constitution of 1867, established a government modeled on the US government with 3 branches, executive, legislative, and judiciary. An accountable structure of governance would be built accordingly, and a key feature of tribal sovereignty. So I'll talk more about each of those, but they represent the keys to our success, right? Care of the people, economic development, law and governance. It's important, in my view, that they emerged in that order chronologically, because the latter two would be constructed very much in the service of the first, that of improving the overall well-being of every tribal citizen. So that's literally the slogan of my current tribal governor, Bill Anortabi, who you are seeing now in these photos here, who served as lieutenant governor under Overton James and was elected himself governor in 1987 and has been our governor through 9 re-elections, the last 4 of them running unopposed. And he has effectively overseen the extraordinary process of economic growth and diversification, expansion of tribal services, creation of tribal infrastructure, as well as cultural revitalization. So the book will look at each of those in turn. So let's start with economic development. When I was growing up, the tribe was quite impoverished and existed on a tiny budget from the BIA. As I said, many of our people were rural dwellers and very poor, and general health was very poor, which is why Overton James focused heavily on health services. He started the tribal health services that we still have today and left important legacies there. But he signaled right away that he wanted to put us on a path to economic development with the motor lodge. We began gaming bingo tables a couple nights a week there. Once Oklahoma law enforcement swarmed the hotel, arrested the employees, and confiscated all of the bingo equipment. But the tribe sued over that and won, which turned out to be an important precedent for upholding our sovereignty. Our tribal industries would really begin to expand significantly in the late 1980s, right as Governor Anthropology is elected, with the passage of the Indian Gaming Regulation Act, which provided a statutory basis for the operation of gaming by Indian tribes as a means of promoting tribal economic development, self-sufficiency, and strong tribal governments. From there, in less than 2 decades, the Chickasaw Nation would become a highly successful economic and political entity, as gaming revenues were being used to establish or expand business ventures, including, a huge range of things from tobacco shops, travel plazas, publishing companies, a chocolate factory, among other things. We got licensed to provide public utilities, water and electricity. And this expansion, the slide you're seeing there, this expansion allowed the tribe to provide employment opportunities to both tribal and non-tribal members. So you can see how those employment opportunities grew massively over these 2 decades, which was really important for the economy of the region. You could go down the slide, please. Today, the Chickasaw Nation operates more than 100 diversified businesses in a variety of industries, from manufacturing to healthcare to media, hospitality, tourism, retail, and more. We have more than 200 tribally funded programs, as well as 60 federally funded programs that provide housing, entertainment, education, healthcare, et cetera. So this economic expansion was really, really unprecedented. And I think, can't see what slide we're on here. You could even go down one more. No, yeah, it's fine. Either one of those images you're looking at are from our annual tribal report from 2022. It's generated by an outside accounting firm audit each year and presented in the governor's State of the Nation address at our annual festival. But I think you can see, I don't know if you can see, those are kind of small, the numbers there, but the growth of our assets has been tremendous. So a lot of factors had to go into making this possible, and there are several particularly important ones from my perspective. One is stable leadership and accountable governance, which, as I mentioned, we have had the benefit of. Another is a political vision that entails both business acumen and the creation of infrastructure for the redistribution of wealth. That infrastructure is really important because otherwise that kind of wealth can become politically divisive really quickly. So the prioritization of unity among our citizens was key. And so again, there are these interrelated things that have kind of characterized Governor Anthropology's 36-year administration, but which we saw emerging even in James's, of economic development, democratic governance, and essentially relationality and care. Creating the infrastructure to redistribute wealth in a way that improves the lives of the people. Each of these is essential to the others. I've talked a bit about the economic development, so let's turn to infrastructure. And I know that sounds super exciting, infrastructure, but it's important to the story. So certainly there were those that fairly quickly after the tribe started making money that began to say that the government should be sending out checks. There were debates about this, per capita checks. People were generally, not wealthy, and perhaps rightly felt that increasing tribal wealth should be benefiting them. Some other tribes were doing per capita checks, that is, dividing the profits among all the tribal citizens in the form of direct payments. I'm grateful for the wisdom of those who understood that we had the capacity to instead use those revenues from gaming and other businesses to build the infrastructure that would be necessary to provide social services and improve the lives of our people in that way. Right away, things started to change for people. Things got better. As I mentioned, Governor Anthropology is famous for saying the mission of the Chickasaw Nation is enhancing the overall quality of life of Chickasaw people. So there's a really clear message there. We're making money, not to make money and have power. And you can go to the next slide here. And just in case you were wondering, we actually are fairly powerful in Oklahoma. That's my tribal governor being named for the 4th time in a row as the most powerful man in Oklahoma. So that's pretty impressive for the leader of a tribal nation. But it wasn't just about, making money for power. It's really about making money for the overarching purpose of making life better for Chickasaw people. And I think that logic was crucial in ensuring that whatever political dissent existed was kept to a minimum, right? The overarching thing was creating this infrastructure of redistribution based on a broad business portfolio that provides economic stability and even in unstable times, and redeploys it to the benefit of Chickasaw people, which in turn encouraged unity and not division amongst us. That doesn't mean there weren't debates about the decisions. There were a lot of discussions, and there were many discussions around what were the most important emphases for redeploying revenues. But revenues were redeployed widely enough to avoid serious dissent. We have universal health care, for example. You see here our state-of-the-art hospital, some of our various health resources. We have multiple regional health clinics and even mobile health clinics that come to your house. In addition to that, we have all kinds of things like addiction recovery centers, shelters for women and children experiencing domestic violence, veteran centers, wellness centers, elder centers. So really a broad redeployment of tribal resources, and everybody, I think, is benefiting in some way and feeling supported by the tribe in some way. The tribe will come over and mow your lawn if you're elderly and need them to. They build storm shelters for everyone. This is tornado country. And in some cases, they build your house for you, right? So without exaggeration, there are just a tremendous number of services that the tribe provides. And this has really made people's life better. And so they are happy with how far we've come as a nation. Certainly none of that would have been possible without effective governance. Governor James and Governor Anthropology have provided strong leadership, but they couldn't have done it alone. A lot of voices, often competing ones, contributed to this. Next slide. A group of folks calling on Governor James, to implement a constitution back before we did the '83 Constitution. Those folks weren't very fond of him. They were political dissenters within the tribe, and they were concerned with having checks on his, at that time, unilateral power as elected governor. When James conformed a group to create a new contemporary constitution, this group, led by attorney Charles Tate, who you see here, and his mother Juanita Tate of Ardmore, they opposed it, insisting that the Constitution of 1867, our original constitution in Indian Territory, was still legally valid, and that was validated by the court. That it had never been invalidated by Oklahoma statehood or any later action. So remember, I said earlier that they virtually eliminated our sovereignty, but not completely. And this became really key, that Constitution was never abrogated. So these debates were serious enough to end up in federal court and in mediation, and both sides were required to publish the differences in the Constitution. So these were very serious debates within the tribe about the different components of the two constitutions. They had to publish those differences in the newspaper and hold a referendum vote of all Chickasaw voters on the differences. But after the process of the referendum, a final constitution was produced and ratified by voters that went into effect in 1983, some 5 years after James's committee wrote that new constitution. So the Constitution, of course, established two other branches of government. So as soon as the Constitution was established in '83, we elected a legislature and established a Supreme Court. You can go to the next slide. Those are our Supreme Court justices today. Both of these branches would see themselves, so the Supreme Court and the legislative branch would see themselves in the early years principally as a check on the executive branch. A number of legislators were openly hostile to Governor James and later Governor Anthropology's initiatives, and very active and lively debates took place between the legislators and in the public comment, with often open criticisms and even attacks on the governors. When impasses between the governor's office and the legislature appeared, they went to tribal judges for resolution, and the tribal judges' main job was to be arbiters between the legislative branch and the executive. So that first decade of governance or more was quite difficult, but I don't think we should be surprised about that. The tribe was undertaking a massive task of reconstructing tribal sovereignty and tribal governance, and the stakes were incredibly high for our people. Those tensions and conflicts went well into the 1990s. Governor Anthropology once told me, if we had had term limits, I would have never made it out of that period, by which he meant the period of ongoing discord. But he did make it out, despite all the conflict. Throughout that decade, the legislature passed resolution after resolution establishing and providing oversight for tribal businesses, and constantly generating new programs and services for citizens. The expansion was really continual and remarkable. And little by little, the branches established a working rhythm, and I think a level of trust. Governor Anthropology was accountable, businesses were going well, services were growing by the day, we were on a good path, and the tribe utilized that to expand our sovereignty even farther. So in the early 2000s, we reclaimed administration of justice from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Go to the next slide. Until then, our cases had been in the Court of Indian Offenses of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA. But we negotiated taking over jurisdiction of non-major crimes and created the district courts, which you see here, as well as the innovative peacemaking courts, and also reestablished the light horse police force, so our own policing force. Next slide. These continued to expand and got an exponential growth spurt in anticipation of the 2020 Supreme Court decision in McGirt v. Oklahoma and the later Sharp v. Murphy case, which reaffirmed the boundaries of the tribal reservations of the 5 civilized tribes, and that they had never been disestablished, and that the reservations were for the purposes of the law Indian country, which vastly increased our jurisdiction over criminal offenses by non-natives against natives in our territory. And so this was really kind of a massive expansion of our administration of justice in the Chickasaw Nation. We went from having maybe 200 cases a year in our courts to having over 2,000. Next slide. So one thing I want to mention is that the tribal government, I've talked a lot about the ways that our tribal government has actively constructed our sovereignty in an inward-looking way about our people, but it's also actively engaged in government-to-government relationships at all levels, from local county governments, where we have reciprocal agreements through which we provide capital for and construct and maintain infrastructure, such as roads and bridges and parks, to state agencies, where we coordinate on everything from providing utility services to like emergency medical responses. We have dozens of compacts with local, state, and federal law enforcement. So there's this very active, we have an ambassador to the US government from our government. So there's a very active outward facing enactment of our sovereignty through these government to government relations. This is, for those not familiar with tribal nations, that's not true for all nations in the way they construct their sovereignty. For many nations, it's very inward looking. So the efforts of Chickasaw leaders to regain political sovereignty were all the more impressive when we see the context in which they were acting. We can see the legacies of the settler colonial process in just about everything. By the 1960s or 70s, so much of our cultural practices had been lost or had declined at least. There was just tremendous cultural loss, particularly in the 20th century. For example, traditionally we were organized in clans, and then we lost that form of social organization. Most of our people, and we're about 75,000 strong today, do not know their clan lineage. A lot of cultural practices, even the foods we ate, there was just acculturation processes well underway. And of course, a lot earlier, but mid-20th century, culture bearers were like, you know, holding on really onto kind of the seeds of our culture. And, you know, sorry, we could go to, yeah, well, that slide, thank you. So I think it was really important that when we began reconstructing our tribal sovereignty, kind of key to that sovereignty was the idea that well-being and sovereignty aren't just healthcare and a new house and getting your college education paid for. It's living in our culture and our language. So vast amounts of resources have been invested into the revitalization of Chickasaw culture and language, and that impacts everyone's quality of life. That's included the construction of our Chickasaw Cultural Center in Sulphur, Oklahoma, which you saw on the last slide. It's a beautiful museum, as well as an archive where you can do research on Chickasaw history and genealogy. also a traditional Chickasaw village. We have the Chickasaw Press, which I mentioned earlier, and the White Dog Press, which is our literary press. And we publish books about Chickasaw history and culture. We have a film production company and a Chickasaw TV station and a radio station, so that we're presenting our own history instead of somebody else's version of it. We have dance troupes that go all over the country. We have teams that play our traditional stickball game, all kinds of cultural education programs for youth and adults. So people are having access to the culture in ways they didn't have before, including people like me who live far, far away. So I have access to all of these things as a tribal citizen. If you can't afford to attend our annual meeting and festival, the tribe will fly you in from wherever you are and pay for your lodging. And while you're there, you can, of course, access our free healthcare and other things. So we've also retaken a lot of our buildings. If you go to the next slide, I think we'll see that on that fancy building on the left is the Chickasaw Motor Lodge today. So we fixed it up a little bit. And the one on the right is our historic Capitol building in Tishomingo. Also, the tribe is working to repurchase our ancestral homelands that we were removed from, and they're opening up museums there and offering tours of the homelands. And they take people, especially youth and elders, and do tours on the lands. And then, of course, the extensive language programs, which are really amazing. We even have a phone app and a Rosetta Stone program. We have people teaching on the ground in Oklahoma in classes and across the country in virtual classes. I've been learning Chickasaw for 5 years now online, and now teaching a class online. We're paid by the tribe to teach these classes. It's a very wide-ranging language revitalization program. A very cool thing about it is that they have a speakers commission in which native speakers, elders, make up new words for things in Chickasaw like computer or texting or cell phone. So, you know, languages are living things, and this is helping to keep our language alive moving into the future. So, all right. So I did want to just mention, we're probably running out of time, but another aspect of our cultural revitalization is the emphasis that we're putting on the fact that we are a matrilineal society. I think, you know, people take that seriously, even though we're located in a really conservative state where obviously gender bias is a real factor. The tribe's been proactive about getting women into leadership positions. More than half of our tribal legislators and more than half of our Supreme Court justices are women. The lead counsel for the Chickasaw Nation is a woman, and several of our major divisions are headed up by women. So Indian women run things in the Chickasaw Nation, and there's really an effort to actively bring women into positions of leadership. So the last thing I'll say, this book is likely to be less theoretical than my previous work and more descriptive, as I've talked about so far, because much of the intended audience for the book will be non-academic. But that said, I will have things to say about debates in the field, and I imagine myself, particularly in publications that spin off of the book, right? And I imagine myself in dialogue with folks working on issues of tribal capitalism, Indigenous understandings of value and meaning of wealth, and Indigenous relationality and care. You know, this is the Chickasaw story is a happy story, but there are many downsides to capitalism for Indigenous people. And in my previous work, I've written about those extensively. I think the Chickasaw experience demonstrates the benefits of engaging capitalism effectively. The downsides for many tribes will come from considerations of how engaging capitalism might run counter to their ethical relations, positions, to what extent it implies assimilation or contributes to culture loss. Those are very real and important considerations. So while I think the Chickasaw example shows that assumptions about Indigenous people and development, that Indigenous people are naturally opposed to capitalism, are wrong, it doesn't mean that's not true for other tribes. The Chickasaw are in a unique position to begin with because of assimilation, relocation, a variety of things. So for us, I think that the revitalization that was facilitated by capitalist revenues outweighs any cultural loss concerns that capitalism might bring. So we're actually getting our culture back through this, not losing it, but that might not be the case for all tribes. And we're getting our sovereignty back in its fullest realization. And there might be some loss of that with capitalist engagement in other contexts. I'm not sure. Other concerns Indigenous people have about engaging with capitalism include environmental damage. This is a very real issue, I think, even for our tribe, which is invested in energy, for example, including things like fracking. That's a very real downside. But I also think that the tribe has worked hard to maintain a relational ethic where our capitalism is associated with individual competition rather than becoming our cultural norm. As we engage in capitalism, we've maintained a relational ethic of care for our people with an emphasis on unity. There's been a lot of debate since the start of tribal gaming. Many analysts express pessimism about the potential of gaming to strengthen the sovereignty of tribes. And I think it's become clear that casinos have been serving as catalysts to a much broader and more effective economic development than other forms of economic development offered. As an anthropologist who's been critical of the role of free market economics or neoliberalism in maintaining Indigenous people in a state of subordination, I see the Chickasaw story as an important challenge to my own assumptions. Arguably, all of the states of the American hemisphere, including the United States, are neoliberal. In other words, these states are characterized by free market economies and the political structures that facilitate them. The meaning of free market is that the government should have as little role as possible in mediating the economy, which should be left to the free play of market forces of supply and demand. In a general sense, this means downsizing government and limiting government spending. It's the opposite of a welfare state in which governments invest heavily in mediating social inequality by providing social services and other benefits to citizens. My argument in the past has been that free markets tend to disenfranchise Native people, leaving them to the play of market forces on what is fundamentally an uneven playing field. However, the Chickasaw Nation has been able to engage successfully in the free market economy to generate significant capital while wisely developing the infrastructure necessary to engage in widespread redistribution through social services to its citizens. This stands an important distinction to the redistributive policies of some gaming tribes, which rely on per capita payments to citizens as a form of redistribution, an approach that can foster exclusion rather than inclusion. Per capita checks would have worked against the tribe's goal of a united people. The creation, instead of a broad and diverse economic portfolio and an effective government infrastructure for the provision of social services, has allowed the nation to avoid many of the potential dangers that are sometimes associated with gaming. In effect, what the tribe has been able to do is engage in the free market economic system, then turn it on its head as it spends much of the capital gain towards providing services and benefits to Chickasaw citizens, reversing the free market logic of government downsizing and withdrawal from the realm of social welfare. It's an example of how a tribe can deploy capitalist economics to subvert the logics of neoliberalism. So I'll say it's not necessarily the case that every tribe could do the same. Different tribes are positioned quite differently across the United States and across the hemisphere and the world. We live in California, where the vast majority of tribes are quite small, some, less than 100 people, and may not have a land base or federal recognition. So those are all, significant barriers to this kind of approach that the Chickasaw Nation has taken. We have large numbers and a land base. And because of that, a number of California tribes have opted for more redistributive checks or per capita checks. But for the tribes, in the Chickasaw case, the relationship between development and sovereignty has been a unique one. And that's the story I want to present in the book Chickasaw Spring. And I think we're probably out of time, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Speed. I appreciate your time and effort presenting this morning. And I wanted to see if anybody in our group this morning would like to ask any questions for Dr. Speed. Okay. Well, we will have this posted on our website. Thank you again for.
Wait. Heidi, actually,
yes.
I did have a question. Sorry,
yes.
I just raised my digital hand.
Please.
Sorry.
I apologize.
No, it's totally fine. So thank you so much. This is a wonderful talk and super interesting. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the fieldwork experience, the research that you've done, and and kind of how kind of your journey to this in terms of how you're going to publish it, and publishing a book that's for a broader audience, and publishing with Chickasaw Nation. Just a little bit more about the decisions you made in pursuing this research, and where it fits into, where you see this kind of research fitting into the project of sovereignty and sort of cultural renaissance that you're also writing about.
Sure, thank you for that. You know, I have to say that the idea for this book emerged at the annual festival one year. This was like 2014 maybe, and you know, I'm listening to the governor give the State of the Union address, and he's showing those statistics on how like we've expanded over the last 2 decades, and just telling the story of how, you know, what we cared about in that process. And I thought, somebody should be writing about this. And so I pitched it to the governor. You got to start there. And he suggested I bring it to the press, and that we work on it together. And I started working on it in 2019, and then of course the pandemic happened, so we got delayed. For me, the field work, and last year I had sabbatical, so I spent a significant period in Oklahoma doing the research. The field research for me was like incredibly fun and enjoyable. So in the past, most of my fieldwork experiences as an anthropologist have been really difficult situations. My first book was on the Zapatista uprising, which was an armed insurgency in southern Mexico. So I was working in the context of a war and a counterinsurgency campaign, and a very fraught kind of context. And then my second book was on Indigenous women migrants from Mexico and Central America that I met in immigration detention centers, and the violence that they suffered in their journeys. And so very difficult working inside the detention centers and trying to write about violence. And suddenly I'm in my own tribal nation doing research on this really, really happy story. Like everyone wants to talk about, everybody's door is open, everybody is sharing information, supporting my process, and working with the tribal press. You know, I'm really happy that I'm fortunate to be at a stage of my career that I can choose to go with a non-academic press for my next book, and honor other kinds of commitments that I have, like the commitment to work collaboratively with my tribe to tell this story that is really everyone's story and not mine to tell. And it's been really cool because they do things like help you do your research, and you know, you get a lot of support that as an individual researcher in the past I haven't had. And I did things that I haven't done in the past, like spend months going through every single page of the legislative minutes since the legislature was formed, and you know, a lot of very fascinating dynamics that came out of doing that kind of archival research. But I also did a lot of interviewing of participants who were involved in these processes. And it's a really important time to be writing the book because a lot of those folks are elders now. And we lost a number of folks in the pandemic, of course. And so capturing their stories and their experience of this process right now seems really urgent and like a vital thing to do for the tribe. So I'm really, really fortunate and honored to be able to be the person working on it.
Thank you. And we're so fortunate to have you at the helm here at UCLA.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions before we close? Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Speed. Thank you on behalf of the Academic Senate, on behalf of Campus Human Resources and Staff Assembly. We thank you for coming this morning and speaking to us. Again, this recording will be on the Staff Assembly website. And again, I apologize for any technical issues we had this morning with the Zoom, and we thank you. So have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.